The Words Hurt by Chris Lofus. The words hurt. They really hurt badly. And they stayed in the air for a long, long time. Greg listened and tried to believe he meant something else. In his head, he repeated them line by line. But no matter how the words were replayed in his head, they stayed there, cruel and mean. And his hurt didn't change or go away even after his dad apologized and said he was just blowing off steam. Greg's dad never hit him. Even when Greg would do things that would make his dad very mad. But boy, could he yell. When he yelled at you, it was worse, chewing out everything, chewing out you've ever had. He seemed to know just what to say, just what would hurt the most. Sometimes he would come back and apologize, but as Mom always says, you can't make dinner rolls out of burnt toast. No, once words are out there, you can't just reel them back in. You can't make them go away with just a wink, with just a wish, or a grin. At night, Greg would sit in his bed and wonder if what his dad said was true. He'd wonder if his dad really meant what he said, and he wondered how much his dad really knew. And do you know what? As nice a guy as Greg was, and as hard as he tried to do the right thing, the words his father yelled at him would sit there in his head and in his heart in a terrible, terrible thing. You see, there was always a little bit of truth in what his dad was saying, enough to leave some doubt as to was he right or was he wrong, or was he in or was he out? He'd wondered if other kids' dads yelled so loudly. Whenever they were late for school, he'd wonder if all the other dads got mad at their kids. He wondered if cleaning your room was every home's very serious rule. Greg also wondered why, after his dad started yelling, his mom would always just leave the house, and why? At dinner time, no one would say anything, each of them just as quiet as a mouse. Greg figured whatever it was, his dad was his dad, and so he must be right. He must not be good enough son. He must not be a good enough son. That was the conclusion he'd come up alone in his bed at night. One day at the ballpark, Greg was playing with some friends when his dad came by to pick him up and yelled, "Greg, it's time to come in." But Greg was talking to his friends in the whole wide world, his best friend, a friendly fellow named Joe. He really didn't hear his dad called, so he had no way to know that his dad was walking up behind him with a look that meant he was really mad. He got up to Greg and Joe, and then he really yelled at the little lad. Greg's dad told him in no uncertain terms that he was the worst son ever there could be. He said he wished that just once Greg would do as he was told and offer his dad something other than misery. Greg's dad went on and on while Greg looked down, wishing he could disappear. Poor Joe. Joe just stood there with his pal, embarrassed for everyone there. Joe's parents walked up to the scene and thought it was best to interrupt. Joe's mom said, "Hi, gang. How's it going, George? Did you catch any pop-ups?" "Sure did, Mom. I caught 7 and Greg here made a bunch of good catches." "Well, that's great, Greg. Maybe we can sit with your parents at some of your matches." Joe moaned. "Matches are in tennis. Baseball has games." He said with a laugh, "Well, whatever." Joe's dad said, holding his nose, "Come along, baby Ruth. It's time you had a bath." Joe's dad put Joe up on his shoulders. His mom nodded and turned away, leaving Greg with his dad standing there looking down at the ground while all around children laughed and played. Greg looked up at his dad's red face, and then he glanced at Joe's family walking through the dimming light, and Greg felt guilty somehow for wishing he could go to that home tonight. Well, as they always do, the next day came, and it was a perfect time to play ball. So after school, Greg met with George, and they raced up the street past the mall. Then down the alley and up the hill, they ran until they reached the edge of the bases. As they walked across the green grass, they could see their fathers in the stand with what looked like very angry faces. The two boys couldn't make out what the two men were saying, but there was an obvious tension. Greg turned to Joe and said, "I'm sorry, man, but my dad gets angry really easy." Joe said, "Well, I was going to tell you that my mom and dad heard your dad yesterday, and it upset them really bad. They said that your father was being pretty mean to you, and it wasn't the first time that he had. Anyway, my mom said it might not be any of their business, but one of them was going to talk with your dad today." And now poor Greg was more embarrassed than ever before. He tried so hard to just look away. He wanted to hear every single word. He wanted Joe's dad to give it to him and to give it to him good. After a few minutes passed, Greg's dad yelled, "Greg, get in that car!" And they drove away. They hadn't gone very far when Greg's dad blunted out, "The nerve of that man telling me that I abuse my child. Why? I'd like to see him work 2 jobs, or in my shoes, walk a mile." Why? Your mom and I work on the house, not to mention the full-time job of keeping this family whole. That suggests that I am harming my child? Well, I just don't even know. Then, like a volcano erupting, Greg just couldn't take it anymore. "I wish you listened to what he was saying," he said with a surprising roar. "You yell at me for every little thing, and you call me names, and I wish I had him for a dad instead of you, and I wish I was 10 feet tall, 'cause then you'd have to be nice to me and stop making me feel so bad." Just then Greg's sorrow caught up with his anger, and then he said, crying, "I wouldn't feel so sad." Greg's dad stopped the car right where they were, and he looked at his son, red and swollen eyes. Then in a sweet way, almost trembling voice, the man said, "Oh, son, how I wish you were telling me lies. I'd wish I'd never yelled at you at once, and I wish I could always make you smile. Wish I was one of those guys who always said the right thing, shoosh, maybe even once in a while. I wish I wasn't so tired at the end of the day, and I wish I didn't feel so old. Boy, I tell you, when I look in the mirror, I see an old man, one that sometimes I don't even know." With that, Greg reached over and wiped his tears away from his father's reddened eyes. He put his little arms around his dad's giant shoulders and said, "It's okay, Daddy. You don't need to cry. And I love you, Dad. I'm going to do better. I'm going to make you proud. You'll see." His father reached over, put his finger on the boy's lips, and said, "Shh. We both know it's me." "What's the problem?" the officer asked. "Why have you stopped here in the middle of the road?" "No problem," Greg and his father said at the same time. They both laughed. Greg said, "Come on, Dad, let's go." And they did, home to Mom, where they all had a very long talk. They decided they needed to get some real help with all of this, and they decided to take a walk. You know, a walk can take you forever, or it can take you down the street. But to get where you need to go, you have to decide to start moving your feet. You have to decide that there is a place that is worth the effort and a place that is worthy of the time. Like Greg and his father in a car that day, sometimes sorrow helps you, your courage find. No one said anything. They all just walked along. They were all thinking of different things. Their hearts all singing a different song. Mom was thinking this was just the thing this family needed to help them get through their troubles. So many times she had heard her husband's anger, but she didn't want to burst his bubble. She knew he was under a lot of pressure, and she wanted everything to be good. Now she realized that she just can't wish things to work out, even though we all wish we could. You have to address your troubles. You have to take them straight on. If you don't, they can get worse and worse, my friends, and the bad days become longer than long. Dad was going over all the things he said to Greg. He knew he must learn to deal with his anger. He couldn't just keep throwing it at his family, or pretty soon they'd all be strangers. Anger is a powerful thing, and a child is usually not. Sometimes adults figure kids won't really remember. Greg seemed to remember a lot. Greg's father did not want to be remembered the way he was sadly remembered his own dad. His father would sometimes be very cruel, and he didn't like the memories he had. The idea that he was doing the same thing was something for which there was no simple excuse. There's no reason in the whole wide world to harm a little child, be it your hands or your words that do the abuse. And he was going to do that. He was going to get help for which he was in need, and he was bound and determined that this kind of anger would never again in his family field take seed. Greg was thinking about what his dad had said in the car just before they had to go. He really does have a lot on his mind, and Greg really knows, and Greg really does love him so. Greg thought of how they used to play in the backyard back when he was just a kid. He thought about how his dad never found him when they played hide and go seek, even through Greg. Never really did a very good job when he hid. And he thought about all the good days when everything was right, when Dad's face offered sunshine and his words offered light. He thought about what Joe's dad had said and his dad's yelling being abuse. Greg had always thought that meant beating up a kid until his body was all black and blue. But when you think about it, not all blows are made by hand, and not all our whipping is done with a belt. Greg thought about some of the things his dad had said to him and had beaten up he had felt. As the family walked around the block for the third time, Greg's parents looked at him and squeezed his tiny hands. His father knelt down, kissing Greg's forehead, and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, my little man." And do you know, if painful words can last forever, kind ones can last just as long. Greg felt like he's been touched by an angel, like he heard the words "pretty song." And if Dad's yelling had broken into his heart and his spirit began to steal that soft look, and kind words had his heart, and his family began to heal. Thank you for sharing your story with me. The Words Hurt, Helping Children Cope with Verbal Abuse. Thank you.